A good vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Let's light up the darkness. Strange days. Yesterday I was all set to go, had the class prepared, go to do what I always do, and there's no internet, no way to get our camera and our little system up to both YouTube and Facebook. I'm going nuts. I'm troubleshooting, but it's just the internet is down. There's nothing I can do. It's not, some app or device on my end. So then I'm on the phone with AT&T for hours, and we finally make the appointment for Monday, etc. After troubleshooting, testing everything. No, you need somebody to come out and fix it. There's no way it can be fixed without a technician. And just before Shabbos, it came back. I don't know why. I don't know why it went out. I don't know why it came back. But rather than go a few more days and be backed up and doing such a big makeup session on Monday, I just decided let's go live tonight. We'll do yesterday's page and today's and be caught up. So sorry if you didn't get notice with enough warning and you're watching on the replay, but if you're watching on the replay, you're seeing the class. It's good to be with you, my holy sisters and brothers. Got some beautiful material tonight. This class is dedicated, and this is the same dedication I would have made yesterday, to two people. My grandmother, Magda, whose yahrzeit was yesterday, the anniversary of her death in 1997. She lived in my house. I grew up with her, eating her cooking and receiving her immeasurable love every day of my life. She was a Holocaust survivor who carried my mother as an infant through a concentration camp. If you've been following the page for a while, you've surely heard me talk about her. When she died, it was a miraculous event for me, that shared death experience that led me to reconnect with Judaism. And some years later, to have the little miracle that happened when I happened to buy book one of the Talmud on day one of this Daf Yomi cycle, although that cycle that began in 2005. So there would be no accidental Talmudist, but for the influence of my grandmother Magda in my life. We dedicate our learning today to her. We also dedicate our learning to my uncle, Jorge Litvak. He died last week, and they had a memorial service for him yesterday, Friday. Very prominent physician from Chile, where I was born, where my father was born, where my grandfather was born. And Jorge made his way to America in the 70s and had a distinguished career as a doctor and in public policy in Washington, D.C. He'll be sorely missed by his family, and we dedicate our learning to him as well. Okay. Where are we holding? We're going to be covering two pages tonight, pages 44 and 45 here in Tractate Sukkah. This is the 7th volume of the Talmud. We are discussing the laws of Sukkot. This volume has 5 chapters. We are in chapter 4. We're discussing the lulav and the special commandment of the willow as it was conducted in the times of the temple and as it's conducted later after the destruction of the temple, how these practices intersect with Shabbos and other related matters. We pick it up near the top of page 44 on the A side. And actually, before I go to say what Rav Zevid said in the name of Rava, I'll just read where the halacha came out. So the lulav nowadays, and we mentioned this a few times the last few days. Nowadays, the lulav is not taken on Shabbos at all, even when the first day of the festival falls on Shabbos. We call it in ancient times, when the first day of the festival came out on Shabbos, then they would take the lulav. They wouldn't carry it to the synagogue or to the temple because it's prohibited to carry on Shabbos, but they would arrange to have it there. And then they would lift it and make the blessing over taking the lulav. Nowadays, we don't do it on Shabbos, even when the first day of the festival falls on Shabbos. And by the way, we started to talk about this a little, and I wanted to be sure I was getting it right. So when we lift the lulav during Sukkot, what we do is we pick it up, but we hold the fruit, the citron, the esrog in Hebrew, upside down so that we haven't really done the mitzvah of lifting the four species together. But we have it in hand, so it's definitely over these three branches and this fruit. And then we say the blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to take the lulav." We mentioned the lulav, the branch of the date palm specifically, but we include all four species. Why the lulav? Because it's the tallest and most prominent one visually. The point is that we say al netilas lulav. We make this because he sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us concerning the taking of the lulav. When we wash our hands on Friday nights, we say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us concerning the taking of our hands." Al netilas yadayim. Right? So why is it that same verb? Now, in many prayer books, that's translated as sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us over the washing of the hands. But that's not what it says. What it says is over the taking of the hands, just like over the taking of the lulav. So it's strange that verb would be used in both contexts. And I spoke about it today with my friend, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. We call him Rav Yehuda. And his take on it was beautiful. So he says, well, what are you doing when you wash your hands? Well, by the way, we do this every morning, that same blessing. It's the first hand washing of the day, the special washing when we pour over the right hand, over the left hand, over the right hand, over the left hand, over the right hand, over the left hand, 3 and 3, but alternating. As we start the day, right? When we sort of leave sleep, leave the bed behind, the first thing we do is wash our hands and we say this blessing. So what are we doing? So Rabbi Yehuda says, well, what are we doing? We're being metaher our hands. We're purifying our hands, right? We're making them tahor, pure. In other words, it's like immersing our hands in a mikvah for purification on Friday nights so that we can go then and make the blessing over the challah, over the bread, and eat the bread and then partake of our meal. It's the blessing prior to eating a meal. During the day so that we can go out in the world. But the first thing we're going to do is put on tefillin, say morning prayers, etc. So it's like we're purifying our hands prior to engaging in God's goodness. Now, when we do it over the lulav, what are we saying? Who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us concerning the taking of the lulav. Before we said that blessing, what did we have? We had the branch of a date palm, a willow, a myrtle, and a fruit. We had 3 sticks and a fruit. When we say that blessing is when we elevate those objects and give them holy purpose. When we say that blessing over our hands, which we've just washed, right? We actually wash and then take. And that's interesting, right? We purify our hands and then take our hands. And what are we doing? We're now elevating those hands to a holy purpose, God willing, right? We're going to use our hands for a holy purpose, to engage in eating from the bounty of God, to engage in Torah study, or to go out in the world and work. Right? We wash our hands before we go to work. It's almost like a surgeon. A surgeon really has that sense that he's going to wash his hands before he goes in to do life-saving work. But any work that we do, any work, If you set aside 10% of your income to charity, at a minimum, that action can transform all the work that you do into holy work, because now you're in partnership with the Holy One, and the income from that work is going to be used for holy purposes, right? 10% goes to the charitable causes that you believe in. And now you're elevating the product of your hands, of the work that your hands do. And it's really a beautiful connection in that verb, taking the hands and taking the lulav. Let's continue. Also, the halakha with respect to the willow branch, that's a ceremony that we do on the 7th day of Sukkot. Since the mitzvah of the willow branch is not explicitly written in the Torah, the sages restricted the ordinance to taking it on the 7th day of Sukkot in commemoration of the temple. That Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot, we do a special ritual with willow branches, several willow branches bound together. And then there's a Kabbalistic practice that we actually bang them on the ground 5 times. We'll come to that later. All right, so on page 44a, Rav Zevid said in the name of Rava, since the mitzvah of lulav is a mitzvah by Torah law, we perform it 7 days in commemoration of the temple, even today. Now, this is them talking at the times of the Talmud. Since the mitzvah of the willow branch is a mitzvah by rabbinic law, we do not perform it 7 days in commemoration of the temple. That's Rav Zevid in the name of Rava. That's actually where the law comes out. Now, the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did Rava say this? If we say that Rava said this in accordance with the opinion of Abba Shaul, didn't he say that it is written, willows of the river, i.e., in the plural, indicating at least 2 willow branches, and one for the lulav and one for the temple, right? So we have 2 mitzvahs that are associated with Sukkot. One is taking the 4 species, every individual, that's incumbent on him. The willow is a special mitzvah performed in the temple when the priests would bring large willow branches and stand them against the altar where sacrifices were brought. And then they would circle the altar once every day of Sukkot. And on the 7th day, they would circle it 7 times. And they would say, please God, save us now. Please God, grant us success. Now, so that was a special mitzvah of the willow. Now, the mitzvah of the willow branch in the temple is also a mitzvah by Torah law. If Rava said this in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, they learned this as a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai, not an explicit Torah law, but a commandment given to Moses orally at Mount Sinai. As Rabbi Asi said, that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Nechunya of the valley of Beis Hortan, the halacha of the 10 saplings, which has to do with the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year every 7 years, the mitzvah of the willow branch in the temple, and the mitzvah of the water libation, which we haven't talked about yet, but is another practice of Sukkot when the temple was standing. The water libation on the altar during the festival of Sukkot are each laws transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. So the special law of the 10 saplings, we're not going to be discussing, but it has to do with when a field may be plowed as we approach a sabbatical year in the land of Israel. But these other 2 laws, the willow branch, the way that was practiced in the temple, and the water libation that was practiced in the temple, it's not written explicitly in the Torah. So one of the traditions teaches that it was given as an oral law, a commandment, but given orally to Moses at Mount Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, the men of the great assembly to the sages. And that's how it came down to us. Excuse me. Rather, Rav Zevid said in the name of Rabbah, with regard to the mitzvah of lulav, which has its basis explicitly in the Torah, in the outlying areas, meaning in Israel but not in the temple, we perform it 7 days in commemoration of the temple. With regard to the mitzvah of the willow branch, which does not have its basis written explicitly in the Torah, in the outlying areas, we do not perform it 7 days in commemoration of the temple, meaning the willow branch ceremony that we do outside of the temple, and this is still the case. We don't do it all 7 days of Sukkot. We only do it on the 7th day, as opposed to taking the 4 species and making that blessing. We do that every day of Sukkot. Apropos the willow branch in the temple, Reish Lakish said, priests with physical defects enter between the entrance hall and the altar in order to fulfill the obligation of the mitzvah of the willow branch. Although due to their blemishes, it is prohibited for them to pass there. Why? A priest with a blemish is not allowed to bring sacrifices in the temple, and this area between the entrance hall and the altar had enhanced sanctity. And the sages, I guess, ruled that priests who have blemishes can't go there lest they come to assist in bringing an offering on the altar, and that would be an aveir, that would be a transgression, because a blemished priest is not allowed to do that. Some blemishes are permanent, and then for the priest was permanently disqualified from his service as a priest. Others were temporary, and he would be disqualified while he had that blemish on his body. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "Who stated this law?" And the Gemara wonders about Rabbi Yochanan's question. Who stated it? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself state it? As Rabbi Asi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Nechuni of the valley of Beis Horton, the halacha of the 10 saplings, the mitzvah of the willow branch, and the mitzvah of the water libation on the altar during the festival of Sukkot are each a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. So rather, Rabbi Yochanan's question was, who said that the mitzvah is fulfilled by taking the willow branch and circling the altar? Perhaps the mitzvah is only fulfilled by standing the willow branches upright surrounding the altar. Right, so we have this, they've been arguing for a while. We've had this mentioned several times. When the temple was standing and the altar was there, it was a very large altar, the place where they brought all the animals up for sacrifice. And we learned that they circled the altar during the days of Sukkot. But did they circle it carrying willow branches? Or did they perform the mitzvah of the willow branch by taking these large willow branches and standing them in an upright position around the altar to decorate the altar during Sukkot with these willow branches? Who said that the mitzvah may be fulfilled even by those with physical defects who are normally not allowed in that area because they might bring offerings up on the altar, but they can participate in the mitzvah of the willow? Perhaps it may only be fulfilled by unblemished priests. It was stated that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. One said that the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ordinance of the prophets, as Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi instituted it in the temple as obligatory. And one said that the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ancient custom practiced by the prophets and adopted by others as well. So they're going to argue this point for a while. This practice of the willow branches in the temple, was it something that the prophets thought to do, and we're not sure why they did it, but they started to do it, and then since the prophets did it, other people, continued the practice, and we still do it? Or did the prophets say, we looked at the law, we looked at the Torah, and we decided that this must be done in the way that a sage would rule and make an ordinance? The difference is, if it's an ordinance, a ruling created by prophets who preceded the sages, but still it's a ruling of the prophets that has legal significance, then before you do that practice, you make a bracha, you say a blessing. If it's a minhag, a custom that the prophets commenced and then others followed in their wake, then you don't say a blessing over it. That's the difference, and that's what they're going to be arguing about it. The Gemara suggests, conclude that it was Rabbi Yochanan who said that the mitzvah of the willow branch was an ordinance of the prophets, and Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ordinance of the prophets, and the Gemara concurs, indeed conclude that it is so. We're going to still come back to that question. Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Abahu, did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say in the name of Rabbi Nechuni of the valley of Beis Horton, the halacha of the 10 saplings, the mitzvah of the willow branch, and the mitzvah of the water libation on the altar during the festival of Sukkot are each a halacha transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai? So if the mitzvah of the willow branch was a law transmitted by God to Moses as part of those core precepts of the oral law that began at Mount Sinai, how can you say that it's an ordinance of the prophets when it was given by God to Moses? It wasn't a law that the prophets made up and created as a ruling. It was given by God to Moses as part of an oral law. How then could he attribute the origin of the mitzvah, the willow branch, to the prophets? And then he quotes Daniel 4:16. He was astonished for a while. And after considering the apparent contradiction, he said that indeed Rabbi Yochanan maintains that the mitzvah of the willow branch is a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. However, over the course of time, during the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the first temple, they forgot some of the laws, including the mitzvah of the willow branch, and then the prophets reinstated those laws that had been missing from Jewish practice during those 70 years of the exile. Here, where Rabbi Yochanan said that it is a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai, he is referring to the mitzvah of the willow branch in the temple. There, where he said that it was established by the prophets, he was referring to the taking of the willow branch in the outlying areas, right? So it's two different practices. They had their root in the same mitzvah, but when the temple was standing, they would decorate the altar with very large willow branches. After the temple was destroyed, or even when the temple stood, but people who couldn't get to the temple and were observing Sukkot in their towns far away from the temple, you do something different with the willow branches, right? You make a procession around a Torah scroll in your synagogue with willow branches, and then when you finish singing about that, you beat those willow branches on the ground. They didn't beat the willow branches on the ground. That was later. But a procession with just a small bundle of willow branches is part of the same mitzvah, but obviously a different practice than what the priests were doing in the temple. Rabbi Ami said, the willow branch taken to fulfill the mitzvah requires a certain measure, and it is taken only in and of itself and not with the lulav, and a person does not fulfill his obligation with the willow branch that is bound with the lulav. You have a willow branch in the lulav bunch, right? The four species, date palm branch, myrtle, and willow, along with the esrog, the fruit. But the fact that you have a willow branch among the four species doesn't fulfill your obligation to also do something with willow branches on the seventh day. The Gemara, since the master said it was taken only in and of itself, it is obvious that a person does not fulfill his obligation with the willow branch that is bound with the lulav. Why were both these statements necessary? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary lest you say that this applies only to a case where he did not lift the willow branch bound with the lulav and then lift it again to fulfill the mitzvah of the willow branch. However, in a case where he lifted the lulav and then he lifted again for the second purpose, a person might think, well, I've got my four species, I got a willow branch in it, so I'm going to lift it up, make the blessing over the four species. Okay, good, I did that. And then later I'm going to lift that same bunch, which includes a willow branch, and use it to fulfill my obligation with respect to the commandment of the willow on the seventh day. And they're saying, no, you can't do that. You need a separate bunch of willow branches, not one, but at least two or three, as in its own unit to fulfill the mitzvah of the willow. Therefore, he teaches us that even if one takes the four species a second time with the express intent of fulfilling the mitzvah of the willow branch, he did not fulfill his obligation, as he must take the willow branch by itself. And Rav Chisda said that Rabbi Yitzchak said, a person fulfills his obligation with the willow branch that is bound with the lulav on the first day of the festival of Sukkot. But that's not the law. And the Gemara relates that Ivu, father of the Amora Rav, said, I was standing before Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, and a certain man brought a willow branch before him to fulfill the mitzvah. He took it and waved it. He waved it, and he did not recite a blessing. And this indicates that he holds, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, that the mitzvah of the willow branch is a custom of the prophets and is therefore performed without a blessing. Similarly, the Gemara relates that Ivu and Hizkiah, the sons of the daughter of Rav, brought a willow branch before Rav to fulfill the mitzvah. He waved it, and did not recite a blessing. And this indicates that he too holds that it is a custom of the prophets. What is the law? No blessing is recited when taking the willow branch nor waving it. The custom is to beat the willow branch on the ground based on the teachings of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal, a Kabbalist from the 1500s in Sfat, Israel. Based on his teachings, the custom is to beat it on the ground 5 times. Okay, so the beating it on the ground was earlier. 5 times comes from the Holy Ari. But the point is that we don't make a blessing when we do the custom of carrying the willows around on the 7th day of Sukkot. And even though there was a mitzvah given to Moses at Mount Sinai about decorating the altar with these very large willow branches, as we're going to read shortly, the idea of the procession in synagogues around the Torah scroll with the willow branches really is descended from a custom of the prophets as they taught the people to do at the beginning of the Second Temple period after the Babylonian exile. An additional halacha was transmitted in the same manner. Ivu said, in the name of Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, a person should not walk on Erev Shabbos more than a distance of 3 parasangs. Rather, he should reach the place where he will stay on Shabbos early enough to ensure that he will have meals prepared for Shabbos. Rav Kahana said, we said that restriction only with regard to where he is returning to his house. However, if he is going to an inn, he relies on the food that he took with him. As he cannot assume that he will find lodgings with food, he brings food sufficient for his needs. Therefore, it is permitted for him to travel a greater distance. The law on this subject is incidental, has nothing to do with Sukkot, but it's being discussed because it's another law or custom that was transmitted by the same figure, right? Ivu, in the name of Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok. One may not walk more than a distance of 3 parasangs on a Friday to ensure that he will arrive at his destination in time to prepare for Shabbos. There's no difference whether he is going home or going elsewhere, as most of the early authorities ruled in accordance with the latter version of Rav Kahana's statement. However, if one is in an unsettled area where he will be unable to prepare for Shabbos, it is preferable that he travel to a settled area, even if that entails walking more than 3 parasangs. If one sent word of his planned arrival for Shabbos, it is also permitted for him to travel farther. The custom is to be lenient in situations where one is riding in a carriage or similar modes of transportation. In recent years, when it is customary to prepare more expansive Shabbos meals, this halacha is not observed at all. So we don't observe this halacha about a limitation on how far a person can walk on Friday. However, the inner spiritual teaching of this is you should be thinking about Friday. You don't just work until right before Shabbos starts and then, throw your pen down. Okay, I'm ready. I stop. Now it's Shabbos. You really want to be spending a significant portion of Friday afternoon getting yourself physically, materially, spiritually, mentally, emotionally ready for Shabbos. Mishna number 2, here in Tractate Sukkot chapter 4. We're at 45a, but we're only going to be reading a few of the paragraphs here in page 45. Mishnah number 2. How is the mitzvah of the willow branch fulfilled? There was a place below Jerusalem, and it was called Motzah. And they would descend there and gather willow branches from there. And they would then come and stand them upright at the sides of the altar in the temple. And the tops of the branches would be inclined over the top of the altar. They would then sound a tekiah, meaning they would blow the shofar. A tekiah is a long followed by a teruah, followed by a tekiah. I'm not blowing the shofar because generally we don't blow the shofar at night. Each day they would circle the altar one time and say, Lord, please save us. Lord, please grant us success. That's from Psalm 118. Rabbi Yehuda says that they would say, Ani Vaho, please save us. And on that day, the 7th day of Sukkot, they would circle the altar 7 times. At the time of their departure, at the end of the festival, what would they say? It is beautiful for you, altar. It is beautiful for you, altar. Rabbi Elazar said they would say, to the Lord and to you, altar, to the Lord and to you, altar. So they would actually address the altar, right? They're not making some kind of a deification of a material object, but they're just talking to it and say, it is beautiful for you, altar. They're addressing, it's almost like giving thanks for being part of our worship of God, this altar that serves all year for bringing the offerings. And we're just giving a little special honor to the altar here on Sukkot, on the 7th day of Sukkot, as we're leaving the festival, right? And that was the day that we prayed for rain. Really, Sukkot was a time of just tremendous rejoicing throughout Jerusalem. Big. It's like you go through the days of awe, Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. Then everybody goes up to Jerusalem. They're there for the week of Sukkot. Every night there's like a massive party. And that's what it has to do with the water libations and all the dancing and rejoicing and eating. And it's a fall holiday. There's been a beautiful harvest. There's abundance. There's food. People are praying together that they'll have an abundant rain during the rainy season. And when that all winds down after the end of the 7th day, right, it's like they're saying goodbye and thank you to the altar for its service, as it were. But then they have one more holiday, the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later, but is often likened to this, like the VIP after party, right? It's like the Lord just wants the people who really love the Lord to have one more day kind of calm and intimate after the massive rejoicing of Sukkot. The last paragraph of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 4, the Mishnah notes, as its performance during the week, so is its performance on Shabbos. This is when the 7th day of Sukkot fell on Shabbos. Now they've arranged the calendar so that doesn't happen, but in ancient times it did. Except for the fact that they would gather branches from Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos, and place them in basins of gold so that they would not dry. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says there was a unique custom to the 7th day. They would bring palm branches to the temple and place them on the ground at the sides of the altar, and that 7th day of Sukkot was called the day of placing palm branches. Immediately after fulfilling the mitzvah of taking the 4 species on the 7th day of the festival of Sukkot, children remove their lulavim, their lulav, from the binding, and they eat their esrogim as an expression of joy. That is the Mishnah. Now we're going to do a couple of the paragraphs of the commentary, the Gemara, on this Mishnah. Rabbi Abahu said, what is the verse that alludes to the fact that the branches must lean 1 cubit over the top of the altar? Now, you got to get this picture. The altar was a large structure with a big ramp. We've talked previously about the fact that, before they started doing a lottery to pick which priest would bring the offerings on any given day in the temple, they used to have races, like which priest would get to the top of that ramp first. So it's like a race. It's a significant ramp to get up to the top of the altar. It's a significant space up there. According to some teachings we've had, there were like 3 or 4 or even 5 bonfires that were burning on top of the altar. Although the main fire is where they would bring the offerings, the elevation offerings that would be burned and go up in smoke as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So this was a large structure. Depending on how you read it, large, 10, 11, 12 cubits high, right? So that's like 18 feet high, big, right? A cubit's about 1.5 feet. And so they would bring willow branches that were more than, 18 feet high, so that 1 cubit of the branch would lean over the top when they decorated around the altar. So these are large branches, 20-foot tall branches, to get that mental picture. And so what is the verse in the Torah in the Bible that alludes to the fact that the branches must lean 1 cubit over the top of the altar? It is as it is stated, encircle Isru with branches on the festival until the horns of the altar. Right, so the horns of the altar were the corners of the altar, which were even higher than the platform itself where they stood and where the bonfire was. The altar fire, and that is facilitated by standing the branches on the base. Right, the branches wouldn't even stand on the ground; they would stand on the base of the altar. And the Gemara cites derivations based on different interpretations of the terms of this verse. Psalm 118:27. Rabbi Bahu said that Rabbi Lazar said with regard to anyone who takes a lulav in its binding and a myrtle branch in its dense-leaved form, the verse ascribes him credit as though he built an altar and sacrificed an offering upon it, as it is stated, bind with dense-leaved branches on the festival until the horns of the altar, which alludes to both the binding of the lulav and the myrtle branch, referred to in the Torah as the branch of a dense-leaved tree. So what they're saying is we have an allusion in Psalm 118 that somebody who takes the 4 species during Sukkot, he is ascribed credit as if he brought an offering on the altar in the temple. We're no longer able to bring offerings on the altar in the temple since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. But every Sukkot, when we take the lulav and esrog, the 4 species, and say a blessing, we get credit in heaven as if we brought an offering. It's a really, really beautiful spiritual teaching. I go over on the B side of page 45. I'm 3 paragraphs away from finishing, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. And Chizkiah said that Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, I am able to absolve the entire world from judgment for sins committed from the day I was created until now. The merit that he accrued through his righteousness and the suffering that he endured atone for the sins of the entire world. Whoa. So we're not reading all that came up to this, but that's okay. This is apropos of, it doesn't matter. It's a little bit of a digression how we got here. Now, who was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai? The Rashbi. He is credited as being the author of the Zohar, sort of like he really, kicked off the mystical tradition in Judaism. And he spent 13 years living in a cave with his son Eliezer. There was a death sentence on him from the Romans, and he had to hide. And so for 13 years, he and his son just lived in this cave, ate carob, and worshipped God, and sort of in a mystical, meditative way, their souls ascended up into the garden. They had mystical experience, right? But even aside from the suffering that they underwent and the learning that they did during that forced imprisonment in the cave, he was a person of tremendous righteousness. Now, this statement of his saying, I'm so righteous that my righteousness atones, for the whole world, that sounds like an incredibly arrogant and presumptuous thing to say. We have a note about that. I am able to absolve the entire world. Rabbeinu Hananel writes that because Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai lived in a cave for 13 years, he enjoyed many divine revelations, almost like prophecy. One was that he was informed by divine sources, angels of heaven, that he was a full-fledged righteous individual, and that is why he could make these audacious statements without being guilty of presumptuousness. And so now we have this idea, and we're going to just explore it a little more in these 3 paragraphs, that there are righteous individuals in the world, and in a sense, they sustain the world. In other words, the vast majority of all the humans in this world are so sinful, right? Or at least add so little materially and spiritually speaking, that even, most people are good, but there's a lot of people out there that are so bad that they would really, outweigh all the good that the average amount of good that most people are doing. The evil that people do would outweigh that. In the whole world, it would be better if it did not exist and God would just, make it disappear. Too much suffering, too much evil. However, there are some righteous individuals in the world whose righteousness pleases God so much that God says, well, on account of this, the good that these few people do, we're going to keep the world in existence. And so different traditions teach, for example, that there are 36 tzaddikim, 36 righteous individuals who are alive in every generation, and the world continues to exist on their account. And this kind of thinking of this calculus that there's a few good people, God won't destroy a large place, goes all the way back to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham negotiating with God, as it were, when God said, Sodom and Gomorrah is so filled with evil, I'm going to just destroy those cities. And Abraham said, well, what if there's some righteous individuals there? What if there's 50 innocent, good people? Are you going to destroy the whole city? God said, well, if there's 50 righteous individuals, I won't. Well, what if the 50 lack 10 and there's only 40, but there's 40 righteous people? And that whole negotiation in the book of Genesis, and they get down to 10. If there's 10 righteous individuals, God won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, there were not 10 righteous individuals, and so he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai continues, right? He says that his righteousness, right, is able to absolve the entire world from the day that he was created, the day that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was born, until the moment when he's speaking. And he says, and were the merit accrued by Eliezer, my son, calculated along with my own, we would absolve the world from for judgment for sins committed from the day the world was created until now, right? Not just from when he was born, but from the whole history of the world up until the moment when he's speaking. And he says, and were the merit accrued by the righteous king Jotham ben Uzziah calculated with our own, we would absolve the world from judgment for sins committed from the day that the world was created until the end of the world, right? The three of them together had enough righteousness to absolve the sins of all of humanity for all time. And Chizkiah said that Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, I have seen members of the caste of the spiritually prominent who are truly righteous, and they are few. If they number 1,000, I and my son are among them. Again, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai talking. If they number 100, I and my son are among them. And if they number 2, I and my son are they. And the Gemara asks, are they so few? But didn't Rava say there are 18,000 righteous individuals in a row before the Holy One, blessed be He, as it is stated, surrounding our 18,000. That's Ezekiel 48:35. Apparently, the righteous are somewhat numerous. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is referring to the very few who view the divine presence through a bright mirror-like partition, while that statement of Rava is referring to those who do not view the divine presence through a bright partition. Right, so and this is another thing we've talked about before. There's so many levels, right, of righteousness, of goodness. Obviously, that's true in our world. And, the culture sometimes tells us that in the next world, there's just heaven or hell. Either you're good or you're bad, you're in paradise or you're in hell. But that's not what Judaism says at all. It says that there's a world of souls that we go to, and in that world, there's an infinite number of levels where people can end up. And not only that, once they get there, they can still rise through those levels, particularly if good deeds continue to be done in this world in the name of the departed. And the Gemara asks further, and are those who view the divine presence through a bright partition so few? But didn't Abaye say that the world has no fewer than 36 righteous people in each generation who greet the divine presence every day, as it is stated, happy are all they that wait for him. Him, lo, vav, alamid, vav. That's the numerical value 36. All those who wait for him, meaning they wait for God each day to greet him, but those that wait are 36. That's where we get this tradition from Isaiah 30:18. The numerological value of lo, spelled lamed, vav, is 36, alluding to the fact that there are at least 36 full-fledged righteous individuals in every generation. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This statement of Abaye is referring to those who enter to greet the divine presence by requesting and being granted permission, while that statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is referring to those who enter even without requesting permission, for whom the gates of heaven are open at all times, and they are very few indeed. However, if a person wants to be more righteous, finally, this last teaching I'll mention, I heard from Rabbi Yehuda Mintz today. He said that he was talking to a Makabal, meaning a Kabbalist in Jerusalem, somebody who really dedicates his life to understanding Jewish mysticism. And a practice of his is every day he goes to the eastern window of his house where the sun rises, and he extends his hands. And rather than say, I'm sure he's already washed his hands and made a blessing on his hands, right? And then rather than say, I'm going to use my hands to take from the world, I'm going to open my hands and receive the first blessing of the day. Here is God granting me a day in this world. I have woken up. The sun is rising. I am alive. What a gift. And never say, God has given me another day. That's diminishing it. Rather, you say, thank you, God, for giving me this day. And start with a serious, beautiful gratitude practice each morning, right? And then you are one of those people who is greeting God each morning, right, in this beautiful and spiritual way. That's what I've got today. Let me check comments or questions. Tom Beck, these oral laws, not explicitly written in the Torah, but transmitted to Moses at Sinai, are they counted among the 613 mitzvahs? That is such a good and seemingly simple and basic question, and I should know the answer to that, and I'm not sure. I'm going to have to look that up. Are the 613 the ones that are explicit in the Torah, or are some of these, like, for example, tefillin, like what tefillin is, that was definitely an oral teaching given to Moses at Sinai. But the fact that we wrap ourselves in tefillin, that's explicit in the Torah. So laws, for example, the mitzvah, the willow branch that we're talking about here, which has its basis, at least the way it was done in the temple, as a halacha leMoshe miSinai, is that one of the 613? I'm going to guess that it is, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to have to look that up. And I guess Sharon, good, thank you. Sharon is giving an answer that according to Maimonides, no, they are not a part of the 613. Okay. And Tom says, this morning in Shul, the rabbi said it's a custom to study laws of the festival 30 days before the festival begins. And according to him, today is 30 days before the start of Sukkot. Absolutely. Today is the 15th of Elul. We're 30 days before the 15th of Tishrei, which is when Sukkot happens. So perfect. We are now fulfilling our obligation to be studying the laws of Sukkot within 30 days before the festival. In fact, we've been studying the laws of Sukkot for 44 days already. But it's very good that we're now studying them within that 30-day window. And that is definitely a general teaching before any holiday. So right now, it's we're already 2 weeks into it. We should be studying the laws of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that would be a very good thing to do, to review for yourselves the halachas of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur during these 30 days leading up to those holidays. And Yosef, I'm sorry I didn't say this at the beginning. I meant to. Yosef says, please pray for us on the East Coast for safety amidst hurricane. I assume it's pronounced Henri. So yes, please, God, spare everyone in the path of Hurricane Henri. May everybody be safe. May there be no casualties. May the damage be kept to a minimum. And we are praying for all of the people in the way of this hurricane. May they be safe. And we say amen. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific, the normal time. I'm going to be traveling a little bit tomorrow afternoon. It's possible that class might start a little bit late. It shouldn't. If for any reason I'm delayed, I'll post, just a little written post saying what time we'll be starting, but it shouldn't come to that. I should be able to start on time. Have a great night and a great week. All the best.